It originally stood over off Gardner Lane, where the bishop's house was sadly recently torn down in one of the most ridiculous battles that we've ever had on preservation. It is an honor to be here to, in fact, honor Mr. Fenwick and to follow the list of people that you all have had speaking over the years. I looked, just sort of getting myself familiar, looked through the list, and you all must have been scraping the bottom of the barrel when you followed me. With the likes of Alan Hugh and Dan Vivian and Winfrey and Scott, to whom this book is dedicated. You all had a great number of people with a great deal of knowledge speak. I hope I can come close to living up to their standards. The topic today is Louisville Classics and the architecture of Hugh Lloyd Nevin and Frederick Morgan. That is a drawing that I just love. Not only do I love the building, but I love the drawing. Two people involved in the firm from the beginning in 1920 until the end of 1970 were Hugh Lloyd Nevin and Frederick Morgan. Hugh Nevin was apparently an absolutely charming gentleman, a devout Presbyterian, an early athlete, a long-time member of the Board of Trustees of Center College, I presume via his Presbyterian involvement, president of the Penn Tennis Club during World War II, apparently just the patron saint of something called the Juniper Club, which is down outside of Ocala, Florida, which is a huge tract of land in the middle. You go to nowhere and then jump off and you get there. But it's a fishing camp that is owned by a group of Louisvillians that started out with Judge Bingham, and Mr. Nevin was part of the group from the beginning. His portrait hangs on the wall of the dining room. From all accounts, he was a perfect gentleman, a fabulous businessman, and between you, me, and the gauge post, couldn't draw his way out of the paper bag. However, as in many fine partnerships, he knew what he didn't have and what he did have, and he was excellent in getting what he needed. And the person who provided the most of that for the longest time was a gentleman named Frederick Morgan. He was from Illinois and went to school at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, and then studied in Europe and worked for a short time in Chicago, but via a gentleman named Earl Gray, whose picture will show up in a little bit, who had also gone to the University of Illinois. He ended up in Louisville working with the school board, and he was ultimately hired into the firm, and he stayed there until it was over. Mr. Nevin died in 1969, and Fred Morgan died in 1970. And the last gentleman standing was a gentleman named Mr. Weber, who closed the firm down. People have wondered why I named it Louisville Classics, because the firm went through 4 different names, and that was too much to put in one title. The first iteration was Nevin Wishmeyer and Morgan, then Nevin Morgan Colebrook, and for the longest period it was simply Nevin and Morgan, and then Nevin Morgan and Weber. You will see Earl Gray on the left. He was, as I say, trained at the University of Illinois Champaign. From all accounts, a wonderful architect who I believe first met Mr. Nevin when he bought a house that Mr. Nevin had built. Because before he decided he was an architect, he was a builder. Before that, he was in the plumbing business. In fact, Stratton Hammond refers to him as the plumber in one of his articles in the Filson Quarterly. But Earl Gray came and joined up with the school board and ultimately went to work with Mr. Nevin, and sadly died in the influenza epidemic in 1920. And the sadder part of the story is that his wife died a month later in childbirth, and they had 2 little children who ended up being raised by aunts and uncles in Illinois. The next gentleman is Herman Wishmeyer, and Herman was also from Louisville, but of German extraction, as you might suspect. as he has so. At any rate, Mr. Wishmeyer was a beautifully trained architect who studied at 2 different German institutions and was hired immediately upon the death of Earl Grey to join the partnership. The next gentleman that shows up is Mr. Colebrook, and Mr. Colebrook is one of those people who learned at the boards back in the day. Had no formal training as an architect, but he was a Louisvillian as well. And I can do a soft shoe. I'm going in the wrong direction. At any rate, Mr. Colebrook stayed with the partnership through the 30s, and I believe was very well connected with the Baptists in town, and at the seminary in particular, and he left in 42 and went out on his own. And from that point, in 1945, a gentleman named Arnold Judd joined the firm. There we go. I'll try to do better this time. Thank you. Arnie Judd was a character from all accounts. He was from Colorado and had gone to the University of Colorado and studied engineering. And he came to Louisville during World War II as part of the Corps of Engineers and stayed around and was hired by Mr. Nevin and Mr. Morgan. And he never made name partner for reasons I don't really understand, but he was a very influential part of the firm during especially the 1950s when they did a good deal of commercial work. Herb Weber was another gentleman who learned at the boards, had no formal architectural training. He became a registered architect in the late 40s, and Fred Morgan signed his application saying that he had plenty of experience to be an architect, even though he had not gone to architecture school. I believe that they became acquainted when the firm was involved in working on the Clarksdale Beach Terrace, thank you. The 2 housing projects that were built right at the beginning of World War II. The thing that the firm began doing right off the bat was churches. The one on the upper left is in Paris, Kentucky, and was done by Mr. Nevin before he became affiliated with the other folk. And frankly, it is an interesting but not up to snuff of the rest of the building. It's basically a facade on a straight chancel. The more interesting is the First Presbyterian down at First and Ormsby, which is basically an arena-style church on the inside, which is allowed by this huge tower in the middle of the transepts that form a Greek cross. First Presbyterian in Richmond, Kentucky is a lovely building, and it was much influenced by an earlier Gothic revival building that they took down and replaced. The Methodist Church on Eastern Parkway is sadly empty right now, but it's interesting because the entrance is not at the nave end under the big window, the entrance is around on Eastern Parkway. And one of the last churches in this batch was one built down in Lebanon, Kentucky, an unusual building in being in stone. And you will also notice that the tower or steeple is not at the front of the church, but is back in a junction between the church and the educational space behind. And you will see that come up again in their work. One of the most interesting, and I think indicative of what was coming, was the Speed Memorial Church up in Speed, Indiana. And this was one of the first associations between the firm and the Speed family, which continued for many years. You will see things in this building that you see a number of times, especially in the 50s. At this church, if you go into what is now our narthex, was our original chapel. And where the doors to the new church are, there was a Palladian window that looked for the world just like that. And if you go to Second Pres now, their chapel, it's a blank Palladian window at the back under the arch ceiling. But That's an idea that they got and ran with for many years. Their early homes, I think that the one in the right-hand upper corner and possibly the one below it were designed by Wishmeyer. But I should say that the records of the firm went to the Frederick. Stratton Hammond said that some of them were burned. Some of them, in no particular order, but without any drawings, went to the Bridwell Library at U of L. And some of them went to the basement of Mr. Weber. And there is no log of what they built. When Winfrey and Scott did the Stratton Hammond book, they had the great advantage. Stratton was not only a meticulous architect, he was a meticulous record keeper, and he had it all. This has been a question of sort of putting the pieces back together. But I think that the house in the upper left is the first one that we know that Fred Morgan did. His initials are on the drawings. That's on Eastern Parkway, and it is what I call a Brookfield house. It is a 3-bay, 2-story brick, living room on one side, dining room and kitchen, upstairs master bedroom, and 2 little bedrooms. There are hundreds of them all over St. Matthews around the country. But this one is particularly notable because of the detailing that takes it above the normal subdivision house. Built for the Haneys, has that beautiful door surround, the tripartite window above. It uses their favorite combination, which you see here: slate roof, copper gutters, white trim, and really good red brick. The White House at the top, I think, was probably designed by Wishmeyer. It has got a whole lot more going on in one place than Morgan tended to do. The house down on the left at the bottom is over on Speed Avenue. It was built for a gentleman named Castleberry Dunkerson. How would you like to sign that every time you go to check? It's a fabulous house and includes a number of things that continue to show up in Morgan's work. This is actually the side of the house that you see to enter, and the formal front faces down the hill to Lauderdale and was taken from a white pine drawing of an academy, Phillips Academy up in New England. Another thing that will occur again and again, the living room and dining room are at the back of the house and join each other and open onto the porch looking to the yard. Other thing you'll see are those 2 chimneys. They would have worked just as well had they been about a third that high. It would have ever been nearly so good looking. And they loved their chimneys. The little house down, it's not a little house, that smaller house down on the right was built for Walter Cumnock and his wife, and I believe the wife was a daughter of the Willets. They were all in the lumber business. And I say in the book that this is sort of Tudor Beethoven masquerading as colonial revival. There's a little bit of everything floating around there, but it's a delightful house sitting into the hill on Castlewood. And they did some gorgeous things at the end of the 20s. The Tway House out in Plainview, thank you, Plainview Dairy, is a magnificent house that after the second coming in atomic war, it will still be standing. The service stair in the back L is poured concrete. And Mrs. Partlow, who is a granddaughter of Mr. Tway, was at a speaking that I gave recently, and she said, "Oh, did you see the place in the basement where he stored all the guns?" In addition to horses and dairy, Mr. Tway made apparently the basis of his money was coal mines in eastern Kentucky, and he apparently was very non-union. So they kept the place for the armory. The house on the upper right was built for Gustav Bro Ballard and is a fascinating combination of things. There's almost one of everything there. There are arched dormers and half dormers and single windows and double windows and French doors and then that wonderful heavy rusticated door surround. There's a magnificent spiral stone staircase in the entry hall of that house. Down on the left, lower left, is the Holman house out in Glenview. which was on the boards at the same time as the Pendennis Club, and many of the interior details are similar to ones you see at the club. The house on the left is the James Thompson house on Lightfoot. Fascinating in many regards. Again, those two massive chimneys, and this is the side of the house that faces Lightfoot, but the house was designed to have the drive come into a court in the back, so that until property was split 10, 15 years ago, the entrance to this house was from the court in the rear. On the back of the book, you will see that even a blind pig sometimes finds a truffle, and I've got a gorgeous photograph from the living room through the entries all to the dining room in that house. It's a splendid house. This is a house that has had a fascinating history that some people love and some people wish were gone. But Drummond was built by the former Miss Strader who became Mrs. Watson, and the grounds were originally laid out by the Homestead firm. It is a fascinating case of, like the Cumnock house, taking a little bit of everything and putting it all together. There's several houses that they did that if you analyze the parts and put them down on a piece of paper and say, how did this all go together? Nah, it would never work. Drummond works. The parlor, or drawing room, is to the left where you see the two French doors, but it is paneled in pine and has beautiful bookshelves, and there's already another library in the house. The door frame is taken from another white pine drawing of a house up in New England, and the back is much more formal. You have a Palladian window over the top of the rear hallway doorway, which opens onto a beautiful garden. The property was bought by the Straders, and Mr. Strader and family went on a Sunday afternoon outing up the creek into Oldham County, and he decided to go swimming, took a dive, and never came back up. Mrs. Strader then married a military gentleman named Mr. Watson, and they built a house. It then was sold by her son to Mrs. Fitzhugh, who was moved there because her house was being demolished by the building of I-64. She thought when she got there that she would never have to face anything like that again. Well, tempus fugit. And then in the 40s, there was another effort to, I presume, the building of 42. And there's correspondence between Mr. Watson and the Olmsted firm at that time about how they can deal with this incursion on the property. As we all know, it was bought by the Commonwealth and tunneled underneath and sat for a number of years. But a gentleman named Steve Fox has recently purchased it, and it is in beautiful condition. He's continuing to work on the grounds as well as the house. My personal opinion is I think we are very lucky that it survived. This is probably one of their finest houses, and will allow me to say a bit about preservation while I'm at it. This is the Boone Porter estate out on 22. If you go down 22 past where the seminary used to be, you go way down a hill to the bottom of the creek. It springs something that turns off to your left. And there's just a little road that sort of goes through a nondescript farm gate. And if you wander back about a quarter of a mile to the top of the hill, you see this magnificent house. It was built for the Porters and modeled on Ridgeway. And Ridgeway and Salima Hall are two of the finest antebellum houses in the East End, and Fred Morgan worked on bringing both of them into the 20th century. This house, if you look at it, if you do this number and cut out the second floor, it's Ridgeway all over again. Like Ridgeway, it has a beautiful entry hall with a pair of arched doors that go into the living room and dining room, which open onto a gorgeous porch, which looks across. This property connects back to the Palmerball property on Westport. So you have a completely unimpeded pastoral view out the back. The hyphen to the right contains an absolutely beautiful independent spiral staircase that goes to the second floor, and their bedrooms all across the top with this hall running transverse rather than through the middle. The wing on the left is a gorgeous library on the first floor, and while it does not compete with Oxmoor as the only one in town that could enter this race anyway, it's a beautiful room and opens out to the field below. Master bedroom located above. Again, you see their classic use of fine red brick, slate roof, huge tall chimneys, copper gutters, and beautifully detailed woodwork where it is essential but not anything. There's nothing there you would take away. This house continues to be owned by the family of Mrs. Porter, and I believe I'm correct that there is a preservation easement on the entire property. So it will be with us for many years to come. They also did small houses. The one on the upper left was built for Dwight Anderson, who was for many years the dean of the music school. The house below was built by Mr. Forty Dennis, but we think for his daughter. He ultimately lived there later. And then during the Depression, Stratton Hammond, Nevin and Morgan, any other architect that could, was desperately trying to get any publicity anywhere they could, because nothing was being built here much. And this is a spread from architectural record of a very small house they designed for, it's out on Taylorsville Road still, in the midst of subdivision. But it was built for the son of the family that owned the farm at that time. Hey, the Hindlings. Read my own notes. They loved colonial precedents, as you can see. The house on the right, it was built, the second house that they designed for Jim Courtney. It is not any identifiable James River plantation house. But you look at it and you immediately go, that's a James River plantation house. And again, you see their finesse in putting together the package. The windows decrease in size and number of panes. Those dormers are taller than any I know about. Those chimneys, again, are 3 times as tall as they need to be to operate. And the doorway was, again, from a white pine drawing from one of the Lees, who was the mayor of Alexandria, Virginia, and the house is still standing on Washington Street. The house on the lower left, which is my cover girl, was built for the Dabney family. Is more of a Maryland house than a Virginia house, I guess you'd say. But they played with the elements. You'll see that the porch, the angle of the roof is slightly less than the angle of the pediment above, and probably a house in Maryland of that era that had the pediment probably wouldn't have had a porch to begin with. They decided they wanted one, and there it is. That's a lovely house that, again, you enter, and it has a hallway and a stair that turn immediately to the left, living room and dining room behind, and then the hyphen on the left leads again to a beautiful panel library which opens up. It's up on the bluff overlooking the Louisville Country Club. These two again are in the category of trying to put it down on paper and see if it works, and it couldn't possibly, and then you have one of the most charming buildings in town. Everybody I know loves Cobble Court. Again, it has triple windows, double windows, half timbering, dormers with jerkin head tops, triangular pediments, a Tudor stone surround. There's nothing but a furnace room and a little vestibule on the first level of this house. And you go up the stairway to the main level where the dining room, living room, dining room, kitchen, and service wing are. And then it was owned for many years by the Campbells, and they added another bedroom wing out the back. The one on the lower left is the second house built for the Collises, up on the country club as well. And again, it's got a little bit of everything. We've got 4 windows, 3 windows, 5 windows, different kinds of dormers, different gables, chimneys everywhere. The garage is into the side of the hill and has that wonderful little bell tower on top. And like many of their houses, there's light through. The living room is light on both sides. The dining room goes out, has light on 3 sides. And then the dining room, the library at the back has light on 3 sides. The dining room on the front there with 5 windows is absolutely bathed in light. This is my wife's favorite. She says she used to come home from college and drive up Overbrook just to look at this house. I mentioned that Mr. Nevin had been in the plumbing business before he became a builder, before he declared himself an architect. And he was in business with a gentleman named Joseph Shyrick. And this gentleman's son, Joseph Shyrick, who had a cabinet building business, hired the firm to build this house in 1940. I was fortunate enough to receive a page of notes that were given by Mrs. Shyrick to the current owner. And she tells the story that Mr. Shyrick, as a child, a Boy Scout, camped out on Mockingbird Valley. And they were camped, and he looked up at the top of the bluff and said, "I'm going to build a house there sometime." And apparently scratched his name in the bark of one of the beech trees. And after he grew up, went to Purdue, came home, got married, did well in the cabinet business. He and his wife found that tree, purchased this land, and built this house. It is, again, very similar in layout. It has the living room, dining room across the back, which opens to a terrace that looks down over the creek on Mockingbird Valley. It has a beautiful spiral staircase. And again, can you imagine building that chimney? The doorway is unique in their work and most anybody's that I've ever seen. The deep rustication around the door, and then the volutes which frame the pineapple at the top. Just a flight of fancy, but it's sufficient to carry the weight of this massive house. After the war, they did a number of houses that were very interesting. The one at the upper left was built for Alice Stahl on Lime Kiln. She had begun in what became known as the honeymoon cottage, which was a tiny little 2-bedroom house that was built right after she bought the property in 1930, but before her famous kidnapping. So it was 15 to 20 years later when she got around to building her main house there. The house on the right at the top is on Bow Lane. Is a lovely house that the saying goes that hard lots or difficult problems lead to good architecture. But they certainly dealt with a very steep declining lot. And to give the house a presence, you walk down the steps from the road, cross the sidewalk, and then go back up the steps to get to the house so that you actually can see the facade of the house as you're driving by. The living room and master bedroom and a covered porch were part of the first floor in its original status, and the kitchen and dining room and the den were in the lower level, which opened out to a lovely terrace that looked out further across the hill. The little house on the left on Sunset Road was built for Arnold Judd, and it looks like it could come off of Duke Gloucester Street in Williamsburg. And Arnold Judd's son, Arne Judd, who was also an architect, he's quoted as saying his father's hero was Mies van der Rohe. And you're thinking, Mies van der Rohe, Gloucester Street, how does all this work? Apparently, Mr. Judd designed a modern house for this lot, decided that he couldn't afford to build it, and had Fred Morgan then design this house for him. It was a 3-bedroom, 1.5-bath house that Judd and their 4 children lived in until Mrs. Judd died very recently. I just find it fascinating that somebody whose forte was modern design and who adored Van der Rohe would end up living in this very Williamsburg house for those many years. The house on the left is lower right, is the house designed for Winford Allen, and it is the only modern structure home that I've found that the firm designed. It is at the end of Fairway Lane, backs up to Louisville built of redwood, has beautiful limestone flooring in the main part of the house, opens completely glass across the back of the living room and dining room, opening out to the woods. The powers that be in Rolling Fields apparently decided that the original design, which had a single slope to the roof, would not fit in with their subdivision. So the house was modified to have the gable across the front. But you see, you've got two good chimneys there, just for emphasis. There are 2 bedrooms on the right and a small sitting room to the left of that big window, and the kitchen behind that. And there are 2 more bedrooms and a studio. Mr. Allen was a sculptor, among other things. And another thing that he did for many years was serve on the board of Burbank Forest, where Mr. Nevin was also on the board for many years. The last houses they did, I think, can be attributed directly to Fred Morgan. The house on the left is actually in Oldham County, one of the very few that are outside of Jefferson. And it was built in 1964 and is virtually a copy and plan of the Collis house up on the country club. The one at the top right was built for Mr. and Ms. Joe Rhodes, again up on the country club, and is very similar in design and layout to a house that firm designed for Mr. and Ms. Arthur King on Woodhill Road back in the 50s. And the house at the lower right, I think, is sort of Fred Morgan's valedictory. It was designed for Mr. and Mrs. Frank Thompson in the early 60s, and you'll see it's a riff on Rose Hill and other fine federal homes in early Kentucky. The Thompsons only lived there for a short time until Mr. Thompson died of a brain tumor. And the house was subsequently sold to the Hoe family. And I could never find anything that said this in writing, but I've heard it for many years, that Mr. Hoe was a member of a prominent Chinese family in the tobacco business. And because of Brown and Williamson's connections to BAT, he decided to buy property in Louisville. And whenever a woman in his family was going to have a child, she came and stayed here, had the child, and then they all went back home with a new American citizen. The Hoes subsequently basically abandoned his house, although kept it in order, and built another